The peasant question. From this theme, I take 4 questions. A. The presentation of the question. B. The peasantry during the bourgeois democratic revolution. C. The peasantry during the proletarian revolution. D. The peasantry after the consolidation of Soviet power. 1. The presentation of the question. Some think that the fundamental thing in Leninism is the peasant question, that the point of departure of Leninism is the question of the peasantry, of its role, its relative importance. This is absolutely wrong. The fundamental question of Leninism, its point of departure, is not the peasant question, but the question of the dictatorship of the proletariat, of the conditions under which it can be achieved, of the conditions under which it can be consolidated. The peasant question, as the question of the ally of the proletariat in its struggle for power, is a derivative question. This circumstance, however, does not in the least deprive the peasant question of the serious and vital importance it unquestionably has for the proletarian revolution. It is known that the serious study of the peasant question in the ranks of Russian Marxists began precisely on the eve of the First Revolution, when the question of overthrowing Tsarism and of realizing the hegemony of the proletariat confronted the party in all its magnitude, and when the question of the ally of the proletariat in the impending bourgeois revolution became of vital importance. It is also known that the peasant question in Russia assumed a still more urgent character during the proletarian revolution, when the question of the dictatorship of the proletariat, of achieving and maintaining it, led to the question of allies for the proletariat in the impending proletarian revolution. And this was natural. Those who are marching towards and preparing to assume power cannot but be interested in the question of who are their real allies. In this sense, the peasant question is part of the general question of the dictatorship of the proletariat, and as such, it is one of the most vital problems of Leninism. The attitude of indifference and sometimes even of outright aversion displayed by the parties of the Second International towards the peasant question is to be explained not only by the specific conditions of development in the West. It is to be explained primarily by the fact that these parties do not believe in the proletarian dictatorship, that they fear revolution and have no intention of leading the proletariat to power. And those who are afraid of revolution, who do not intend to lead the proletarians to power, cannot be interested in the question of allies for the proletariat in the revolution. To them, the question of allies is one of indifference, of no immediate significance. The ironical attitude of the heroes of the Second International towards the peasant question is regarded by them as a sign of good breeding, a sign of true Marxism. As a matter of fact, there is not a grain of Marxism in this, for indifference towards so important a question as the peasant question on the eve of the proletarian revolution is the reverse side of the repudiation of the dictatorship of the proletariat. It is an unmistakable sign of downright betrayal of Marxism. The question is as follows. Are the revolutionary potentialities latent in the peasantry by virtue of certain conditions of its existence already exhausted or not? And if not, is there any hope, any basis, for utilizing these potentialities for the proletarian revolution, for transforming the peasantry, the exploited majority of it, from the reserve of the bourgeoisie, which it was during the bourgeois revolutions in the West and still is even now, into a reserve of the proletariat, into its ally? Leninism replies to this question in the affirmative, i.e., it recognizes the existence of revolutionary capacities in the ranks of the majority of the peasantry, and the possibility of using these in the interests of the proletarian dictatorship. The history of the 3 revolutions in Russia fully corroborates the conclusions of Leninism on this score. Hence the practical conclusion that the toiling masses of the peasantry must be supported in their struggle against bondage and exploitation, in their struggle for deliverance from oppression and poverty. Cipation movement of the proletariat, which, in one way or another, brings grist to the mill of the proletarian revolution, and which helps to transform the peasantry into a reserve and ally of the working class. 2. The peasantry during the bourgeois democratic revolution. This period extends from the First Russian Revolution to the Second Revolution, inclusive. The characteristic feature of this period is the emancipation of the peasantry from the influence of the liberal bourgeoisie, the peasantry's desertion of the cadets, its turn towards the proletariat, towards the Bolshevik party. The history of this period is the history of the struggle between the cadets and the Bolsheviks for the peasantry. The outcome of this struggle was decided by the Duma period, for the period of the 4 Dumas served as an object lesson to the peasantry, and this lesson brought home to the peasantry the fact that they would receive neither land nor liberty at the hands of the cadets, that the Tsar was wholly in favor of the landlords, and that the cadets were supporting the Tsar, that the only force they could rely on for assistance was the urban workers, the proletariat. The imperialist war merely confirmed the lessons of the Duma period, and consummated the peasantry's desertion of the bourgeoisie, consummated the isolation of the liberal bourgeoisie, for the years of the war revealed the utter futility, the utter deceptiveness of all hopes of obtaining peace from the Tsar and his bourgeois allies. Without the object lessons of the Duma period, the hegemony of the proletariat would have been impossible. That is how the alliance between the workers and the peasants in the bourgeois democratic revolution took shape. That is how the hegemony of the proletariat in the common struggle for the overthrow of Tsarism took shape, the hegemony which led to the February Revolution of 1917. The bourgeois revolutions in the West took, as is well known, a different road. Their hegemony in the revolution belonged not to the proletariat, which by reason of its weakness did not and could not represent an independent political force, but to the liberal bourgeoisie. Geoisie. There the peasantry acted as the reserve of the bourgeoisie. There the revolution, in consequence of this, led to an enormous increase in the political weight of the bourgeoisie. In Russia, on the contrary, the bourgeois revolution produced quite opposite results. The revolution in Russia led not to the strengthening, but to the weakening of the bourgeoisie as a political force, not to an increase in its political reserves, but to the loss of its main reserve, to the loss of the peasantry. The bourgeois revolution in Russia brought to the forefront not the liberal bourgeoisie, but the revolutionary proletariat, rallying around the latter the millions of the peasantry. Incidentally, this explains why the bourgeois revolution in Russia passed into a proletarian revolution in a comparatively short space of time. The hegemony of the proletariat was the embryo of, and the transitional stage to, the dictatorship of the proletariat. How is this peculiar phenomenon of the Russian Revolution, which has no precedent in the history of the bourgeois revolutions of the West, to be explained? Whence this peculiarity? It is to be explained by the fact that the bourgeois revolution unfolded in Russia under more advanced conditions of class struggle than in the West, that the Russian proletariat had at that time already become an independent political force, whereas the liberal bourgeoisie, frightened by the revolutionary spirit of the proletariat, lost all semblance of revolutionary spirit and turned towards an alliance with the Tsar and the landlords against the revolution, against the workers and peasants. We should bear in mind the following circumstances, which determine the peculiar character of the Russian bourgeois revolution. A. The unprecedented concentration of Russian industry on the eve of the revolution. It is known, for instance, that in Russia 54% of all the workers were employed in enterprises employing over 500 workers each, whereas in so highly developed a country as the United States of America, no more than 33% of all the workers were employed in such enterprises. It scarcely needs proof that this circumstance alone, in view of the existence of a revolutionary party like the party of the Bolsheviks, transformed the working class of Russia into an immense force in the political life of the country. B. The hideous forms of exploitation in the factories, coupled with the intolerable police regime of the Tsarist henchmen, a circumstance which transformed every important strike of the workers into an imposing political action and steeled the working class as a force that was revolutionary to the end. C. The political flabbiness of the Russian bourgeoisie, which after the revolution of 1905 turned into servility to Tsarism and downright counter-revolution, a fact to be explained not only by the revolutionary spirit of the Russian proletariat, which flung the Russian bourgeoisie into the embrace of Tsarism, but also by the direct dependence of this bourgeoisie upon government contracts. D. The existence in the countryside of the most hideous and most intolerable survivals of serfdom, coupled with the unlimited power of the landlords, a circumstance which threw the peasantry into the embrace of the revolution. E. Tsarism, which stifled everything that was alive, and whose tyranny aggravated the oppression of the capitalist and the landlord, a circumstance which united the struggle of the workers and peasants into a single torrent of revolution. F. The imperialist war, which fused all these contradictions in the political life of Russia into a profound revolutionary crisis, and which lent the revolution tremendous striking force. To whom could the peasantry turn under these circumstances? From whom could it seek support against the unlimited power of the landlords, against the tyranny of the Tsar, against the devastating war which was ruining it? From the liberal bourgeoisie. But it was an enemy, as the long years of experience of all four Dumas had proved. From the socialist revolutionaries? The socialist revolutionaries were better than the cadets, of course, and their program was suitable, almost a peasant program. But what could the socialist revolutionaries offer, considering that they thought of relying only on the peasants and were weak in the towns, from which the enemy primarily drew its forces? Where was the new force which would stop at nothing, either in town or country, which would boldly march in the front ranks to fight the Tsar and the landlords, which would help the peasantry to extricate itself from bondage, from land hunger, from oppression, from war? Sigh at all, yes, there was. It was the Russian proletariat which had shown its strength, its ability to fight to the end, its boldness and revolutionary spirit, as far back as 1905. At any rate, there was no other such force, nor could any other be found anywhere. That is why the peasantry, when it turned its back on the cadets and attached itself to the socialist revolutionaries, at the same time came to realize the necessity of submitting to the leadership of such a courageous leader of the revolution as the Russian proletariat. Such were the circumstances which determined the peculiar character of the Russian bourgeois revolution. 3. The peasantry during the proletarian revolution. This period extends from the February Revolution of 1917 to the October Revolution of 1917. This period is comparatively short, 8 months in all, but from the point of view of the political enlightenment and revolutionary training of the masses, these 8 months can safely be put on a par with whole decades of ordinary constitutional development, for they were 8 months of revolution. The characteristic feature of this period was the further revolutionization of the peasantry, its disillusionment with the socialist revolutionaries, the peasantry's desertion of the socialist revolutionaries, its new turn towards a direct rally around the proletariat as the only consistently revolutionary force capable of leading the country to peace. The history of this period is the history of the struggle between the socialist revolutionaries and the Bolsheviks for the peasantry to win over the majority of the peasantry. The outcome of this struggle was decided by the coalition period, the Kerensky period, the refusal of the socialist revolutionaries and the Mensheviks to confiscate the landlord's land, the fight of the socialist revolutionaries and Mensheviks to continue the war, the June offensive at the front, the introduction of capital punishment for soldiers, the Kornilov revolt. Whereas before, in the preceding period, the basic question of the revolution had been the overthrow of the Tsar and of the power of the landlords. Now, in the period following the February Revolution, when there was no longer any Tsar, and when the interminable war had exhausted the economy of the country and utterly ruined the peasantry, the question of liquidating the war became the main problem of the revolution. The center of gravity had manifestly shifted from purely internal questions to the main question, the war. End the war. Let's get out of the war. Such was the general outcry of the war-weary nation and primarily of the peasantry. But in order to get out of the war, it was necessary to overthrow the provisional government. It was necessary to overthrow the power of the bourgeoisie. It was necessary to overthrow the power of the socialist revolutionaries and Mensheviks. For they, and they alone, were dragging out the war to a victorious finish. Practically, there was no way of getting out of the war except by overthrowing the bourgeoisie. This was a new revolution, a proletarian revolution, for it ousted from power the last group of the imperialist bourgeoisie, its extreme left wing, the Socialist Revolutionary Party and the Mensheviks, in order to set up a new proletarian power, the power of the Soviets, in order to put in power the party of the revolutionary proletariat, the Bolshevik Party, the party of the revolutionary struggle against the imperialist war and for a democratic peace. The majority of the peasantry supported the struggle of the workers for peace, for the power of the Soviets. There was no other way out for the peasantry, nor could there be any other way out. Thus, the Kerensky period was a great object lesson for the toiling masses of the peasantry, for it showed clearly that with the socialist revolutionaries and Mensheviks in power, the country would not extricate itself from the war, and the peasants would never get either land or liberty. That the Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries differed from the cadets only in their honeyed phrases and false promises, while they actually pursued the same imperialist cadet policy, that the only power that could lead the country onto the proper road was the power of the Soviets. The further prolongation of the war merely confirmed the truth of this lesson, spurred on the revolution, and drove millions of peasants and soldiers to rally directly around the proletarian revolution. The isolation of the socialist revolutionaries and Mensheviks became an incontrovertible fact. Without the object lessons of the coalition period, the dictatorship of the proletariat would have been impossible. Such were the circumstances which facilitated the process of the bourgeois revolution passing into the proletarian revolution. That is how the dictatorship of the proletariat took shape in Russia. 4. The peasantry after the consolidation of Soviet power. Whereas before, in the first period of the revolution, the main objective was the overthrow of Tsarism, and later, after the February Revolution, the primary objective was to get out of the imperialist war by overthrowing the bourgeoisie. Now, after the liquidation of the Civil War and the consolidation of Soviet power, questions of economic construction came to the forefront. Strengthen and develop the nationalized industry. For this purpose, link up industry with peasant economy through state-regulated trade. Replace the surplus appropriation system by the tax in kind, so as later on, by gradually lowering the tax in kind, to reduce matters to the exchange of products of industry for the products of peasant farming. Revive trade and develop the cooperatives, drawing into them the vast masses of the peasantry. This is how Lenin outlined the immediate tasks of economic construction on the way to building the foundations of socialist economy. It is said that this task may prove beyond the strength of a peasant country like Russia. Some skeptics even say that it is simply utopian, impossible, for the peasantry is a peasantry. It consists of small producers, and therefore cannot be of use in organizing the foundations of socialist production. But the skeptics are mistaken, for they fail to take into account certain circumstances which in the present case are of decisive significance. Let us examine the most important of these. Firstly, the peasantry in the Soviet Union must not be confused with the peasantry in the West. A peasantry that has been schooled in 3 revolutions, that fought against the Tsar and the power of the bourgeoisie, side by side with the proletariat and under the leadership of the proletariat. A peasantry that has received land and peace at the hands of the proletarian revolution, and by reason of this has become the reserve of the proletariat. Such a peasantry cannot but be different from a peasantry which during the bourgeois revolution fought under the leadership of the liberal bourgeoisie, which received land at the hands of that bourgeoisie, and in view of this became the reserve of the bourgeoisie. It scarcely needs proof that the Soviet peasantry, which has learnt to appreciate its political friendship and political collaboration with the proletariat, and which owes its freedom to this friendship and collaboration, cannot but represent exceptionally favorable material for economic collaboration with the proletariat. Engels said that the conquest of political power by the Socialist Party has become a matter of the not-too-distant future, that in order to conquer political power, this party must first go from the towns to the country, must become a power in the countryside. He wrote this in the 90s of the last century, having in mind the Western peasantry. Does it need proof that the Russian communists, after accomplishing an enormous amount of work in this field in the course of 3 revolutions, have already succeeded in gaining in the countryside an influence and backing, the like of which our Western comrades dare not even dream of? How can it be denied that this circumstance must decidedly facilitate the organization of economic collaboration between the working class and the peasantry of Russia? The skeptics maintain that the small peasants are a factor that is incompatible with socialist construction. But listen to what Engels says about the small peasants of the West. We are decidedly on the side of the small peasant. We shall do everything at all permissible to make his lot more bearable, to facilitate his transition to the cooperative, should he decide to do so, and even to make it possible for him to remain on his small holding for a protracted length of time to think the matter over, should he still be unable to bring himself to this decision. We do this not only because we consider the small peasant who does his own work as virtually belonging to us, but also in the direct interest of the party. The greater the number of peasants whom we can save from being actually hurled down into the proletariat, whom we can win to our side while they are still peasants, the more quickly and easily the social transformation will be accomplished. It will serve us not to wait with this transformation until capitalist production has developed everywhere to its utmost consequences, until the last small handicraftsman and the last small peasant have fallen victim to capitalist large-scale production. The material sacrifices to be made for this purpose in the interest of the peasants and to be defrayed out of public funds can, from the point of view of capitalist economy, be viewed only as money thrown away. But it is nevertheless an excellent investment because it will effect a perhaps tenfold saving in the cost of the social reorganization in general. In this sense, we can, therefore, afford to deal very liberally with the peasants. That is what Engels said, having in mind the Western peasantry. But is it not clear that what Engels said can nowhere be realized so easily and so completely as in the land of the dictatorship of the proletariat? Is it not clear that only in Soviet Russia is it possible at once and to the fullest extent for the small peasant who does his own work to come over to our side, for the material sacrifices necessary for this to be made, and for the necessary liberality towards the peasants to be displayed? Is it not clear that these and similar measures for the benefit of the peasantry are already being carried out in Russia? How can it be denied that this circumstance in its turn must facilitate and advance the work of economic construction in the land of the Soviets? Secondly, agriculture in Russia must not be confused with agriculture in the West. There, agriculture is developing along the ordinary lines of capitalism, under conditions of profound differentiation among the peasantry, with large landed estates and private capitalist latifundia at one extreme, and pauperism, destitution, and wage slavery at the other. Owing to this, disintegration and decay are quite natural there, not so in Russia. Here agriculture cannot develop along such a path, if for no other reason than that the existence of Soviet power and the nationalization of the principal instruments and means of production preclude such a development. In Russia, the development of agriculture must proceed along a different path, along the path of organizing millions of small and middle peasants in cooperatives, along the path of developing in the countryside a mass cooperative movement supported by the state by means of preferential credits. Lenin rightly pointed out in his articles on cooperation that the development of agriculture in our country must proceed along a new path, along the path of drawing the majority of the peasants into socialist construction through the cooperatives, along the path of gradually introducing into agriculture the principles of collectivism, first in the sphere of marketing and later in the sphere of production of agricultural products. Of extreme interest in this respect are several new phenomena observed in the countryside in connection with the work of the agricultural cooperatives. It is well known that new, large organizations have sprung up within the Selskosoyuz in different branches of agriculture, such as production of flax, potatoes, butter, etc., which have a great future before them. Of these, the Flax Center, for instance, unites a whole network of peasant flax growers' associations. The Flax Center supplies the peasants with seeds and implements. Then it buys all the flax produced by these peasants, disposes of it on the market on a large scale, guarantees the peasants a share in the profits, and in this way links peasant economy with state industry through the Selskosoyuz. What shall we call this form of organization of production? In my opinion, it is the domestic system of large-scale state socialist production in the sphere of agriculture. In speaking of the domestic system of state socialist production, I do so by analogy with the domestic system under capitalism, let us say in the textile industry, where the handicraftsmen received their raw material and tools from the capitalist and turned over to him the entire product of their labor, thus being in fact semi-wage earners working in their own homes. This is one of numerous indices showing the path along which our agriculture must develop. There is no need to mention here similar indices in other branches of agriculture. It scarcely needs proof that the vast majority of the peasantry will eagerly take this new path of development, rejecting the path of private capitalist latifundia and wage slavery, the path of destitution and ruin. Here is what Lenin says about the path of development of our agriculture. State power over all large-scale means of production, state power in the hands of the proletariat, the alliance of this proletariat with the many millions of small and very small peasants, the assured leadership of the peasantry by the proletariat, etc. Is not this all that is necessary for building a complete socialist society from the cooperatives? From the cooperatives alone, which we formerly looked down upon as huckstering, and which from a certain aspect we have the right to look down upon as such now, under the NEP? Is this not all that is necessary for building a complete socialist society? This is not yet the building of socialist society, but it is all that is necessary and sufficient for this building. Further on, speaking of the necessity of giving financial and other assistance to the cooperatives as a new principle of organizing the population and a new social system under the dictatorship of the proletariat, Lenin continues. Every social system arises only with the financial assistance of a definite class. There is no need to mention the hundreds and hundreds of millions of rubles that the birth of free capitalism cost. Now we must realize and apply in our practical work the fact that the social system, which we must now give more than usual assistance, is the cooperative system. But it must be assisted in the real sense of the word, i.e., it will not be enough to interpret assistance to mean assistance for any kind of cooperative trade. By assistance, we must mean assistance for cooperative trade in which really large masses of the population really take part. What do all these facts prove? That the skeptics are wrong, that Leninism is right in regarding the masses of laboring peasants as the reserve of the proletariat, that the proletariat in power can and must use this reserve in order to link industry with agriculture, to advance socialist construction, and to provide for the dictatorship of the proletariat, that necessary foundation. 6. The national question. The national question. From this theme I take two main questions. A. The presentation of the question. B. The liberation movement of the oppressed peoples and the proletarian revolution. 1. The presentation of the question. During the last 2 decades, the national question has undergone a number of very important changes. The national question in the period of the Second International and the national question in the period of Leninism are far from being the same thing. They differ profoundly from each other, not only in their scope, but also in their intrinsic character. Formerly, the national question was usually confined to a narrow circle of questions, concerning primarily civilized nationalities. The Irish, the Hungarians, the Poles, the Finns, the Serbs, and several other European nationalities. That was the circle of unequal peoples in whose destinies the leaders of the Second International were interested. The scores and hundreds of millions of Asiatic and African peoples who are suffering national oppression in its most savage and cruel form usually remained outside of their field of vision. They hesitated to put white and black, civilized and uncivilized, on the same plane. 2 or 3 meaningless, lukewarm resolutions, which carefully evaded the question of liberating the colonies, that was all the leaders of the Second International could boast of. Now we can say that this duplicity and half-heartedness in dealing with the national question has been brought to an end. Leninism laid bare this crying incongruity, broke down the wall between whites and blacks, between Europeans and Asiatics, between the civilized and uncivilized slaves of imperialism, and thus linked the national question with the question of the colonies. The national question was thereby transformed from a particular and internal state problem into a general and international problem, into a world problem of emancipating the oppressed peoples in the dependent countries and colonies from the yoke of imperialism. Formerly, the principle of self-determination of nations was usually misinterpreted, and not infrequently, it was narrowed down to the idea of the right of nations to autonomy. Certain leaders of the Second International even went so far as to turn the right to self-determination into the right to cultural autonomy, i.e., the right of oppressed nations to have their own cultural institutions, leaving all political power in the hands of the ruling nation. As a consequence, the idea of self-determination stood in danger of being transformed from an instrument for combating annexations into an instrument for justifying them. Now we can say that this confusion has been cleared up. Leninism broadened the conception of self-determination, interpreting it as the right of the oppressed peoples of the dependent countries and colonies to complete secession, as the right of nations to independent existence as states. This precluded the possibility of justifying annexations by interpreting the right to self-determination as the right to autonomy. Thus, the principle of self-determination itself was transformed from an instrument for deceiving the masses, which it undoubtedly was in the hands of the social chauvinists during the imperialist war, into an instrument for exposing all imperialist aspirations and chauvinist machinations, into an instrument for the political education of the masses in the spirit of internationalism. Formerly, the question of the oppressed nations was usually regarded as purely a juridical question. Solemn proclamations about national equality of rights, innumerable declarations about the equality of nations, that was the stock in trade of the parties of the Second International, which glossed over the fact that equality of nations under imperialism, where one group of nations lives by exploiting another group of nations, is sheer mockery of the oppressed nations. Now we can say that this bourgeois juridical point of view on the national question has been exposed. Leninism brought the national question down from the lofty heights of high-sounding declarations to solid ground, and declared that pronouncements about the equality of nations, not backed by the direct support of the proletarian parties for the liberation struggle of the oppressed nations, are meaningless and false. In this way, the question of the oppressed nations became one of supporting the oppressed nations, of rendering real and continuous assistance to them in their struggle against imperialism for real equality of nations, for their independent existence as states. Formerly, the national question was regarded from a reformist point of view as an independent question having no connection with the general question of the power of capital, of the overthrow of imperialism, of the proletarian revolution. It was tacitly assumed that the victory of the proletariat in Europe was possible without a direct alliance with the liberation movement in the colonies, that the national colonial question could be solved on the quiet of its own accord, off the highway of the proletarian revolution, without a revolutionary struggle against imperialism. Now we can say that this anti-revolutionary point of view has been exposed. Leninism has proved, and the imperialist war and the revolution in Russia have confirmed, that the national question can be solved only in connection with and on the basis of the proletarian revolution, and that the road to victory of the revolution in the West lies through the revolutionary alliance with the liberation movement of the colonies and dependent countries against imperialism. The national question is a part of the general question of the proletarian revolution, a part of the question of the dictatorship of the proletariat. The question is as follows: are the revolutionary potentialities latent in the revolutionary liberation movement of the oppressed countries already exhausted or not? And if not, is there any hope, any basis, for utilizing these potentialities for the proletarian revolution, for transforming the dependent and colonial countries from a reserve of the imperialist bourgeoisie into a reserve of the revolutionary proletariat, into an ally of the latter? Leninism replies to this question in the affirmative, i.e., it recognizes the existence of revolutionary capacities in the national liberation movement of the oppressed countries and the possibility of using these for overthrowing the common enemy, for overthrowing imperialism. The mechanics of the development of imperialism, the imperialist war, and the revolution in Russia wholly confirm the conclusions of Leninism on this score. Hence the necessity for the proletariat of the dominant nations to support, resolutely and actively to support, the national liberation movement of the oppressed and dependent peoples. This does not mean, of course, that the proletariat must support every national movement, everywhere and always, in every individual concrete case. It means that support must be given to such national movements as tend to weaken, to overthrow imperialism, and not to strengthen and preserve it. Cases occur when the national movements in certain oppressed countries come into conflict with the interests of the development of the proletarian movement. In such cases, support is of course entirely out of the question. The question of the rights of nations is not an isolated, self-sufficient question. It is a part of the general problem of the proletarian revolution, subordinate to the whole, and must be considered from the point of view of the whole. In the 40s of the last century, Marx supported the national movement of the Poles and Hungarians and was opposed to the national movement of the Czechs and the South Slavs. Why? Because the Czechs and the South Slavs were then reactionary peoples, Russian outposts in Europe, outposts of absolutism, whereas the Poles and the Hungarians were revolutionary peoples fighting against absolutism. Because support of the national movement of the Czechs and the South Slavs was at that time equivalent to indirect support for Tsarism, the most dangerous enemy of the revolutionary movement in Europe. The various demands of democracy, writes Lenin, including self-determination, are not an absolute but a small part of the general democratic world movement. In individual concrete cases, the part may contradict the whole. If so, it must be rejected. This is the position in regard to the question of particular national movements, of the possible reactionary character of these movements, if, of course, they are appraised not from the formal point of view, not from the point of view of abstract rights, but concretely from the point of view of the interests of the revolutionary movement. The same must be said of the revolutionary character of national movements in general. The unquestionably revolutionary character of the vast majority of national movements is as relative and peculiar as is the possible reactionary character of certain particular national movements. The revolutionary character of a national movement under the conditions of imperialist oppression does not necessarily presuppose the existence of proletarian elements in the movement, the existence of a revolutionary or a republican program of the movement, the existence of a democratic basis of the movement. The struggle that the Emir of Afghanistan is waging for the independence of Afghanistan is objectively a revolutionary struggle, despite the monarchist views of the Emir and his associates, for it weakens, disintegrates, and undermines imperialism. Whereas the struggle waged by such desperate Democrats and socialists, revolutionaries and Republicans, as for example Kerensky and Tsereteli, Renaudel and Scheidemann, Chernov and Dan, Henderson and Kleins, during the imperialist war was a reactionary struggle, for its result was the embellishment, the strengthening, the victory of imperialism. For the same reasons, the struggle that the Egyptian merchants and bourgeois intellectuals are waging for the independence of Egypt is objectively a revolutionary struggle. Despite the bourgeois origin and bourgeois title of the leaders of the Egyptian national movement, despite the fact that they are opposed to socialism, whereas the struggle that the British Labour government is waging to preserve Egypt's dependent position is for the same reasons a reactionary struggle, despite the proletarian origin and the proletarian title of the members of that government, despite the fact that they are for socialism. There is no need to mention the national movement in other, larger, colonial and dependent countries, such as India and China, every step of which along the road to liberation, even if it runs counter to the demands of formal democracy, is a steam hammer blow at imperialism, i.e., is undoubtedly a revolutionary step. Lenin was right in saying that the national movement of the oppressed countries should be appraised not from the point of view of formal democracy, but from the point of view of the actual results, as shown by the general balance sheet of the struggle against imperialism. That is to say, not in isolation, but on a world scale. 2. The liberation movement of the oppressed peoples and the proletarian revolution. In solving the national question, Leninism proceeds from the following theses. A. The world is divided into two camps. The camp of a handful of civilized nations, which possess finance capital and exploit the vast majority of the population of the globe. 2. That majority. B. The colonies and the dependent countries, oppressed and exploited by finance capital, constitute a vast reserve and a very important source of strength for imperialism. C. The revolutionary struggle of the oppressed peoples in the dependent and colonial countries against imperialism is the only road that leads to their emancipation from oppression and exploitation. D. The most important colonial and dependent countries have already taken the path of the national liberation movement, which cannot but lead to the crisis of world capitalism. E. The interests of the proletarian movement in the developed countries and of the national liberation movement in the colonies call for the union of these two forms of the revolutionary movement into a common front against the common enemy, against imperialism. F. The victory of the working class in the developed countries and the liberation of the oppressed peoples from the yoke of imperialism are impossible without the formation and the consolidation of a common revolutionary front. G. The formation of a common revolutionary front is impossible unless the proletariat of the oppressor nations renders direct and determined support to the liberation movement of the oppressed peoples against the imperialism of its own country, for no nation can be free if it oppresses other nations. H. This support implies the upholding, defense, and implementation of the slogan of the right of nations to secession, to independent existence as states. I. Unless this slogan is implemented, the union and collaboration of nations within a single world economic system, which is the material basis for the victory of world socialism, cannot be brought about. J. This union can only be voluntary, arising on the basis of mutual confidence and fraternal relations among peoples. Hence, the two sides, the two tendencies in the national question. The tendency towards political emancipation from the shackles of imperialism and towards the formation of an independent national state, a tendency which arose as a consequence of imperialist oppression and colonial exploitation, and the tendency towards closer economic relations among nations, which arose as a result of the formation of a world market and a world economic system. Developing capitalism, says Lenin, knows two historical tendencies in the national question. First, the awakening of national life and national movements, struggle against all national oppression, creation of national states. Second, development and acceleration of all kinds of intercourse between nations, breakdown of national barriers, creation of the international unity of capital, of economic life in general, of politics, science, etc. Both tendencies are a worldwide law of capitalism. The first predominates at the beginning of its development. The second characterizes mature capitalism that is moving towards its transformation into socialist society. For imperialism, these two tendencies represent irreconcilable contradictions, because imperialism cannot exist without exploiting colonies and forcibly retaining them within the framework of the integral whole. Because imperialism can bring nations together only by means of annexations and colonial conquest, without which imperialism is, generally speaking, inconceivable. For communism, on the contrary, these tendencies are but two sides of a single cause, the cause of the emancipation of the oppressed peoples from the yoke of imperialism. Because communism knows that the union of peoples in a single world economic system is possible only on the basis of mutual confidence and voluntary agreement, and that the road to the formation of a voluntary union of peoples lies through the separation of the colonies from the integral imperialist whole, through the transformation of the colonies into independent states. Hence the necessity for a stubborn, continuous, and determined struggle against the dominant nation chauvinism of the socialists of the ruling nations, who do not want to fight their imperialist governments, who do not want to support the struggle of the oppressed peoples in their colonies for emancipation, from oppression, for secession. Without such a struggle, the education of the working class of the ruling nations, in the spirit of true internationalism, in the spirit of closer relations with the toiling masses of the dependent countries and colonies, in the spirit of real preparation for the proletarian revolution, is inconceivable. The revolution would not have been victorious in Russia, and Kolchak and Denikin would not have been crushed had not the Russian proletariat enjoyed the sympathy and support of the oppressed peoples of the former Russian Empire. But to win the sympathy and support of these peoples, it had first of all to break the fetters of Russian imperialism and free these peoples from the yoke of national oppression. Without this, it would have been impossible to consolidate Soviet power, to implant real internationalism, and to create that remarkable organization for the collaboration of peoples which is called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and which is the living prototype of the future union of peoples in a single world economic system. Hence the necessity of fighting against the national isolationism, narrowness, and aloofness of the socialists in the oppressed countries, who do not want to rise above their national parochialism, and who do not understand the connection between the liberation movement in their own countries and the proletarian movement in the ruling countries. Without such a struggle, it is inconceivable that the proletariat of the oppressed nations can maintain an independent policy and its class solidarity with the proletariat of the ruling countries in the fight for the overthrow of the common enemy, in the fight for the overthrow of imperialism. Without such a struggle, internationalism would be impossible. Such is the way in which the toiling masses of the dominant and of the oppressed nations must be educated in the spirit of revolutionary internationalism. Here is what Lenin says about this twofold task of communism in educating the workers in the spirit of internationalism. Can such education be concretely identical in great oppressing nations and in small oppressed nations, in annexing nations and in annexed nations? Obviously not. The way to the one goal, to complete equality, to the closest relations and the subsequent amalgamation of all nations, obviously proceeds here by different routes in each concrete case. In the same way, let us say, as the route to a point in the middle of a given page lies towards the left from one edge and towards the right from the opposite edge. If a social democrat belonging to a great, oppressing, annexing nation, while advocating the amalgamation of nations in general, were to forget even for one moment that his Nicholas II, his Wilhelm, George, Poincaré, etc., also stands for amalgamation with small nations, Nicholas II being for amalgamation with Galicia, Wilhelm II for amalgamation with Belgium, etc., such a social democrat would be a ridiculous doctrinaire in theory and an abettor of imperialism in practice. The weight of emphasis in the internationalist education of the workers in the oppressing countries must necessarily consist in their advocating and upholding freedom of secession for oppressed countries. Without this, there can be no internationalism. It is our right and duty to treat every social democrat of an oppressing nation who fails to conduct such propaganda as an imperialist and a scoundrel. This is an absolute demand, even if the chance of secession being possible and feasible before the introduction of socialism be only 1 in 1,000. On the other hand, a social democrat belonging to a small nation must emphasize in his agitation the second word of our general formula, voluntary union of nations. He may, without violating his duties as an internationalist, be in favor of either the political independence of his nation or its inclusion in a neighboring state XYZ, etc. But in all cases, he must fight against small nation narrow-mindedness, isolationism, and aloofness. He must fight for the recognition of the whole and the general, for the subordination of the interests of the particular to the interests of the general. Tyen think there is a contradiction in social democrats of oppressing nations insisting on freedom of secession, while social democrats of oppressed nations insist on freedom of union. However, a little reflection will show that there is not and cannot be any other road leading from the given situation to internationalism and the amalgamation of nations, any other road to this goal. Strategy and tactics. From this theme, I take 6 questions. A. Strategy and tactics as the science of leadership in the class struggle of the proletariat. B. Stages of the revolution and strategy. C. The flow and ebb of the movement and tactics. D. Strategic leadership. E. Tactical leadership. F. Reformism and revolutionism. 1. Strategy and tactics as the science of leadership in the class struggle of the proletariat. The period of the domination of the Second International was mainly a period of the formation and training of the proletarian political armies under conditions of more or less peaceful development. It was the period of parliamentarism as the predominant form of the class struggle. Questions of great class conflicts, of preparing the proletariat for revolutionary clashes, of the means of achieving the dictatorship of the proletariat, did not seem to be on the order of the day at that time. The task was confined to utilizing all means of legal development for the purpose of forming and training the proletarian armies, to utilizing parliamentarism in conformity with the conditions under which the status of the proletariat remained, and, as it seemed, had to remain, that of an opposition. It scarcely needs proof that in such a period and with such a conception of the tasks of the proletariat, there could be neither an integral strategy nor any elaborated tactics. There were fragmentary and detached ideas about tactics and strategy, but no tactics or strategy as such. The mortal sin of the Second International was not that it pursued at that time the tactics of utilizing parliamentary forms of struggle, but that it overestimated the importance of these forms, that it considered them virtually the only forms, and that when the period of open revolutionary battles set in, and the question of extra-parliamentary forms of struggle came to the fore, the parties of the Second International turned their backs on these new tasks, refused to shoulder them. only in the subsequent period, the period of direct action by the proletariat, the period of proletarian revolution, when the question of overthrowing the bourgeoisie became a question of immediate practical action. When the question of the reserves of the proletariat became one of the most burning questions. When all forms of struggle and of organization, parliamentary and extra-parliamentary, had quite clearly manifested themselves, only in this period could an integral strategy and elaborated tactics for the struggle of the proletariat be worked out. It was precisely in this period that Lenin brought out into the light of day the brilliant ideas of Marx and Engels on tactics and strategy that had been suppressed by the opportunists of the Second International. But Lenin did not confine himself to restoring particular tactical propositions of Marx and Engels. He developed them further and supplemented them with new ideas and propositions, combining them all into a system of rules and guiding principles for the leadership of the class struggle of the proletariat. Lenin's pamphlets, such as What is to be Done, Two Tactics, Imperialism, The State and Revolution, The Proletarian Revolution, and The Renegade Kautsky, Left-Wing Communism, undoubtedly constitute priceless contributions to the general treasury of Marxism, to its revolutionary arsenal. The strategy and tactics of Leninism constitute the science of leadership in the revolutionary struggle of the proletariat. 2. Stages of the revolution and strategy. Strategy is the determination of the direction of the main blow of the proletariat at a given stage of the revolution, the elaboration of a corresponding plan for the disposition of the revolutionary forces, the fight to carry out this plan throughout the given stage of the revolution. Our revolution had already passed through 2 stages, and after the October Revolution it entered a 3rd one. Our strategy changed accordingly. First stage, 1903 to February 1917. Objective, to overthrow Tsarism and completely wipe out the survivals of medievalism. The main force of the revolution, the proletariat. Immediate reserves, the peasantry. Direction of the main blow, the isolation of the liberal monarchist bourgeoisie, which was striving to win over the peasantry and liquidate the revolution by a compromise with Tsarism. Plan for the disposition of forces, alliance of the working class with the peasantry. The proletariat must carry to completion the democratic revolution by allying to itself the mass of the peasantry in order to crush by force the resistance of the autocracy and to paralyze the instability of the bourgeoisie. Second stage, March 1917 to October 1917. Objective, to overthrow imperialism in Russia and to withdraw from the imperialist war. The main force of the revolution, the proletariat. Immediate reserves, the poor peasantry. The proletariat of neighboring countries as probable reserves. The protracted war and the crisis of imperialism as a favorable factor. Direction of the main blow, isolation of the petty bourgeois Democrats, who were striving to win over the toiling masses of the peasantry and to put an end to the revolution by a compromise with imperialism. Plan for the disposition of forces, alliance of the proletariat with the poor peasantry. The proletariat must accomplish the socialist revolution by allying to itself the mass of the semi-proletarian elements of the population in order to crush by force the resistance of the bourgeoisie and to paralyze the instability of the peasantry and the petty bourgeoisie. Third stage, began after the October Revolution. Objective, to consolidate the dictatorship of the proletariat in one country, using it as a base for the defeat of imperialism in all countries. The revolution spreads beyond the confines of one country. The epoch of world revolution has begun. The main forces of the revolution, the dictatorship of the proletariat in one country, the revolutionary movement of the proletariat in all countries. Main reserves, the semi-proletarian and small peasant masses in the developed countries, the liberation movement in the colonies and dependent countries. Direction of the main blow, isolation of the petty bourgeois Democrats, isolation of the parties of the Second International, which constitute the main support of the policy of compromise with imperialism. Plan for the disposition of forces, alliance of the proletarian revolution with the liberation movement in the colonies and the dependent countries. Strategy deals with the main forces of the revolution and their reserves. It changes with the passing of the revolution from one stage to another, but remains basically unchanged throughout a given stage. 3. The flow and ebb of the movement and tactics. Tactics are the determination of the line of conduct of the proletariat in the comparatively short period of the flow or ebb of the movement, of the rise or decline of the revolution, the fight to carry out this line by means of replacing old forms of struggle and organization by new ones, old slogans by new ones, by combining these forms, etc. While the object of strategy is to win the war against Tsarism, let us say, or against the bourgeoisie, to carry through the struggle against Tsarism or against the bourgeoisie to its end, tactics pursue less important objects, for their aim is not the winning of the war as a whole, but the winning of some particular engagements or some particular battles, the carrying through successfully of some particular campaigns or actions corresponding to the concrete circumstances in the given period of rise or decline of the revolution. Tactics are a part of strategy, subordinate to it and serving it. Tactics change according to flow and ebb. While the strategic plan remained unchanged during the first stage of the revolution, tactics changed several times during that period. In the period from 1903 to 1905, the party pursued offensive tactics, for the tide of the revolution was rising, the movement was on the upgrade, and tactics had to proceed from this fact. Accordingly, the forms of struggle were revolutionary, corresponding to the requirements of the rising tide of the revolution. Local political strikes, political demonstrations, the general political strike, boycott of the Duma, uprising, revolutionary fighting slogans, such were the successive forms of struggle during that period. These changes in the forms of struggle were accompanied by corresponding changes in the forms of organization. Factory committees, revolutionary peasant committees, strike committees, Soviets of workers' deputies, a workers' party operating more or less openly, such were the forms of organization during that period. In the period from 1907 to 1912, the party was compelled to resort to tactics of retreat, for we then experienced a decline in the revolutionary movement, the ebb of the revolution, and tactics necessarily had to take this fact into consideration. The forms of struggle, as well as the forms of organization, changed accordingly. Instead of the boycott of the Duma, participation in the Duma; instead of open revolutionary actions outside the Duma, actions and work in the Duma; instead of general political strikes, partial economic strikes, airy mass organizations were replaced by cultural, educational, cooperative, insurance, and other legal organizations. The same must be said of the second and third stages of the revolution, during which tactics changed dozens of times, whereas the strategic plans remained unchanged. Tactics deal with the forms of struggle and the forms of organization of the proletariat, with their changes and combinations. During a given stage of the revolution, tactics may change several times, depending on the flow or ebb, the rise or decline of the revolution. 4. Strategic leadership. The reserves of the revolution can be direct: A. The peasantry and in general the intermediate strata of the population within the country; B. The proletariat of neighboring countries; C. The revolutionary movement in the colonies and dependent countries; D. The conquests and gains of the dictatorship of the proletariat, part of which the proletariat may give up temporarily, while retaining superiority of forces in order to buy off a powerful enemy and gain a respite. And indirect: A. The contradictions and conflicts among the non-proletarian classes within the country, which can be utilized by the proletariat to weaken the enemy and to strengthen its own reserves. B. Contradictions, conflicts, and wars among the bourgeois states hostile to the proletarian state, which can be utilized by the proletariat in its offensive or in maneuvering in the event of a forced retreat. There is no need to speak at length about the reserves of the first category, as their significance is clear to everyone. As for the reserves of the second category, whose significance is not always clear, it must be said that sometimes they are of prime importance for the progress of the revolution. One can hardly deny the enormous importance, for example, of the conflict between the petty bourgeois democrats and the liberal monarchist bourgeoisie during and after the First Revolution, which undoubtedly played its part in freeing the peasantry from the influence of the bourgeoisie. Still less reason is there for denying the colossal importance of the fact that the principal groups of imperialists were engaged in a deadly war during the period of the October Revolution, when the imperialists, engrossed in war among themselves, were unable to concentrate their forces against the young Soviet power, and the proletariat, for this very reason, was able to get down to the work of organizing its forces and consolidating its power, and to prepare the route of Kolchak and Denikin. It must be presumed that now, when the contradictions among the imperialist groups are becoming more and more profound, and when a new war among them is becoming inevitable, reserves of this description will assume ever greater importance for the proletariat. The task of strategic leadership is to make proper use of all these reserves for the achievement of the main object of the revolution at the given stage of its development. What does making proper use of reserves mean? It means fulfilling certain necessary conditions, of which the following must be regarded as the principal ones. Firstly, the concentration of the main forces of the revolution at the enemy's most vulnerable spot at the decisive moment, when the revolution has already become ripe, when the offensive is going full steam ahead, when insurrection is knocking at the door, and when bringing the reserves up to the vanguard is the decisive condition of success. The party's strategy during the period from April to October 1917 can be taken as an example of this manner of utilizing reserves. Undoubtedly, the enemy's most vulnerable spot at that time was the war. Undoubtedly, it was on this question, as the fundamental one, that the party rallied the broadest masses of the population around the proletarian vanguard. The party's strategy during that period was, while training the vanguard for street action by means of manifestations and demonstrations, to bring the reserves up to the vanguard through the medium of the Soviets in the rear and the soldiers' committees at the front. The outcome of the revolution has shown that the reserves were properly utilized. Here is what Lenin, paraphrasing the well-known theses of Marx and Engels on insurrection, says about this condition of the strategic utilization of the forces of the revolution. 1. Never play with insurrection, but when beginning it, firmly realize that you must go to the end. 2. Concentrate a great superiority of forces at the decisive point, at the decisive moment. Otherwise, the enemy, who has the advantage of better preparation and organization, will destroy the insurgents. And 3. Once the insurrection has begun, you must act with the greatest determination and by all means, without fail, take the offensive. The defensive is the death of every armed rising. 4. You must try to take the enemy by surprise and seize the moment when his forces are scattered. 5. You must strive for daily successes, even if small, and at all costs retain the moral ascendancy. Secondly, the selection of the moment for the decisive blow, of the moment for starting the insurrection, so timed as to coincide with the moment when the crisis has reached its climax, when it is already the case that the vanguard is prepared to fight to the end. The reserves are prepared to support the vanguard, and maximum consternation reigns in the ranks of the enemy. The decisive battle, says Lenin, may be deemed to have fully matured if all the class forces hostile to us have become sufficiently entangled, are sufficiently at loggerheads, have sufficiently weakened themselves in a struggle which is beyond their strength. If all the vacillating, wavering, unstable, intermediate elements, the petty bourgeois Democrats as distinct from the bourgeoisie, have sufficiently exposed themselves in the eyes of the people, have sufficiently disgraced themselves through their practical bankruptcy. If among the proletariat, a mass sentiment in favor of supporting the most determined, supremely bold, revolutionary action against the bourgeoisie has arisen and begun vigorously to grow, then revolution is indeed ripe. Then indeed, if we have correctly gauged all the conditions indicated above, and if we have chosen the moment rightly, our victory is assured. The manner in which the October uprising was carried out may be taken as a model of such strategy. Failure to observe this condition leads to a dangerous error called loss of tempo when the party lags behind the movement or runs far ahead of it, courting the danger of failure. An example of such loss of tempo, of how the moment for an uprising should not be chosen, may be seen in the attempt made by a section of our comrades to begin the uprising by arresting the Democratic Conference in September 1917, when wavering was still apparent in the Soviets, when the armies at the front were still at the crossroads, when the reserves had not yet been brought up to the vanguard. Thirdly, undeviating pursuit of the course adopted, no matter what difficulties and complications are encountered on the road towards the goal. This is necessary in order that the vanguard may not lose sight of the main goal of the struggle, and that the masses may not stray from the road while marching towards that goal and striving to rally around the vanguard. Failure to observe this condition leads to a grave error, well known to sailors as losing one's bearings. As an example of this, losing one's bearings, we may take the erroneous conduct of our party when, immediately after the Democratic Conference, it adopted a resolution to participate in the pre-parliament. For the moment, the party, as it were, forgot that the pre-parliament was an attempt of the bourgeoisie to switch the country from the path of the Soviets to the path of bourgeois parliamentarism, that the party's participation in such a body might result in mixing everything up and confusing the workers and peasants, who were waging a revolutionary struggle under the slogan, "All power to the Soviets." This mistake was rectified by the withdrawal of the Bolsheviks from the pre-parliament. Fourthly, maneuvering the reserves with a view to effecting a proper retreat when the enemy is strong, when retreat is inevitable, when to accept battle forced upon us by the enemy is obviously disadvantageous, when, with the given relation of forces, retreat becomes the only way to escape a blow against the vanguard and to retain the reserves for the latter. To experience, that victory is impossible unless they have learned both how to attack and how to retreat properly. The object of this strategy is to gain time, to disrupt the enemy, and to accumulate forces in order later to assume the offensive. The signing of the Brest Peace may be taken as a model of this strategy, for it enabled the party to gain time, to take advantage of the conflicts in the camp of the imperialists, to disrupt the forces of the enemy, to retain the support of the peasantry, and to accumulate forces in preparation for the offensive against Kolchak and Denikin. In concluding a separate peace, said Lenin at that time, we free ourselves as much as is possible at the present moment from both warring imperialist groups. We take advantage of their mutual enmity and warfare, which hinder them from making a deal against us, and for a certain period have our hands free to advance and to consolidate the socialist revolution. Now even the biggest fool, said Lenin 3 years after the Brest Peace, can see that the Brest Peace was a concession that strengthened us and broke up the forces of international imperialism. Such are the principal conditions which ensure correct strategic leadership. 5. Tactical leadership. Tactical leadership is a part of strategic leadership, subordinated to the tasks and the requirements of the latter. The task of tactical leadership is to master all forms of struggle and organization of the proletariat, and to ensure that they are used properly so as to achieve, with the given relation of forces, the maximum results necessary to prepare for strategic success. What is meant by making proper use of the forms of struggle and organization of the proletariat? It means fulfilling certain necessary conditions, of which the following must be regarded as the principal ones. Firstly, to put in the forefront precisely those forms of struggle and organization which are best suited to the conditions prevailing during the flow or ebb of the movement at a given moment, and which therefore can facilitate and ensure the bringing of the masses to the revolutionary positions, the bringing of the millions to the revolutionary front, and their disposition at the revolutionary front. The point here is not that the vanguard should realize the impossibility of preserving the old regime and the inevitability of its overthrow. The point is that the masses, the millions, should understand this inevitability and display their readiness to support the vanguard. But the masses can understand this only from their own experience. The task is to enable the vast masses to realize from their own experience the inevitability of the overthrow of the old regime, to promote such methods of struggle and forms of organization as will make it easier for the masses to realize from experience the correctness of the revolutionary slogans. The vanguard would have become detached from the working class, and the working class would have lost contact with the masses if the party had not decided at the time to participate in the Duma. If it had not decided to concentrate its forces on work in the Duma and to develop a struggle on the basis of this work, in order to make it easier for the masses to realize from their own experience the futility of the Duma, the falsity of the promises of the cadets, the impossibility of compromise with Tsarism, and the inevitability of an alliance between the peasantry and the working class. Had the masses not gained their experience during the period of the Duma, the exposure of the cadets and the hegemony of the proletariat would have been impossible. The danger of the Otsovist tactics was that they threatened to detach the vanguard from the millions of its reserves. The party would have become detached from the working class, and the working class would have lost its influence among the broad masses of the peasants and soldiers if the proletariat had followed the left communists, who called for an uprising in April 1917, when the Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries had not yet exposed themselves as advocates of war and imperialism, when the masses had not yet realized from their own experience the falsity of the speeches of the Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries about peace, land, and freedom. Had the masses not gained this experience during the Kerensky period, the Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries would not have been isolated, and the dictatorship of the proletariat would have been impossible. Therefore, the tactics of patiently explaining the mistakes of the petty bourgeois parties and of open struggle in the Soviets were the only correct tactics. The danger of the tactics of the left communists was that they threatened to transform the party from the leader of the proletarian revolution into a handful of feudal conspirators with no ground to stand on. Victory cannot be won with the vanguard alone, says Lenin. To throw the vanguard alone into the decisive battle, before the whole class, before the broad masses, have taken up a position either of direct support of the vanguard or at least of benevolent neutrality towards it, would be not merely folly, but a crime. And in order that actually the whole class, that actually the broad masses of the working people and those oppressed by capital may take up such a position, propaganda and agitation alone are not enough. For this, the masses must have their own political experience. Such is the fundamental law of all great revolutions, now confirmed with astonishing force and vividness, not only in Russia but also in Germany. Not only the uncultured, often illiterate masses of Russia, but the highly cultured, entirely literate masses of Germany had to realize through their own painful experience the absolute impotence and spinelessness, the absolute helplessness and servility to the bourgeoisie, the utter vileness of the government of the Knights of the Second International, the absolute inevitability of a dictatorship of the extreme reactionaries as the only alternative to a dictatorship of the proletariat in order to turn resolutely towards communism. Secondly, to locate at any given moment the particular link in the chain of processes which, if grasped, will enable us to keep hold of the whole chain and to prepare the conditions for achieving strategic success. The point here is to single out from all the tasks confronting the party the particular immediate task, the fulfillment of which constitutes the central point, and the accomplishment of which ensures the successful fulfillment of the other immediate tasks. The importance of this thesis may be illustrated by two examples, one of which could be taken from the remote past and the other from the immediate present. In the period of the formation of the party, when the innumerable circles and organizations had not yet been linked together, when amateurishness and the parochial outlook of the circles were corroding the party from top to bottom, when ideological confusion was the characteristic feature of the internal life of the party, the main link and the main task in the chain of links and in the chain of tasks then confronting the party proved to be the establishment of an all-Russian illegal newspaper. Why? Because under the conditions then prevailing, only by means of an all-Russian illegal newspaper was it possible to create a solid core of the party capable of uniting the innumerable circles and organizations into one whole, to prepare the conditions for ideological and tactical unity, and thus to build the foundations for the formation of a real party. During the period of transition from war to economic construction, when industry was vegetating in the grip of disruption and agriculture was suffering from a shortage of urban manufactured goods, when the establishment of a bond between state industry and peasant economy became the fundamental condition for successful socialist construction, in that period it turned out that the main link in the chain of processes, the main task among a number of tasks, was to develop trade. Why? Because under the conditions of the NEP, the bond between industry and peasant economy cannot be established except through trade. Because under the conditions of the NEP, production without sale is fatal for industry. Because industry can be expanded only by the expansion of sales as a result of developing trade. Because only after we have consolidated our position in the sphere of trade, only after we have secured control of trade, only after we have secured this link can there be any hope of linking industry with the peasant market and successfully fulfilling the other immediate tasks in order to create the conditions for building the foundations of socialist economy. It is not enough to be a revolutionary and an adherent of socialism or a communist in general, says Lenin. One must be able at each particular moment to find the particular link in the chain, which one must grasp with all one's might in order to keep hold of the whole chain and to prepare firmly for the transition to the next link. At the present time, this link is the revival of internal trade under proper state regulation. Trade, that is the link in the historical chain of events in the transitional forms of our socialist construction in 1921-22, which we must grasp with all our might. Such are the principal conditions which ensure correct tactical leadership. 6. Reformism and revolutionism. What is the difference between revolutionary tactics and reformist tactics? Some think that Leninism is opposed to reforms, opposed to compromises, and to agreements in general. This is absolutely wrong. Bolsheviks know as well as anybody else that in a certain sense, every little helps, that under certain conditions, reforms in general, and compromises and agreements in particular, are necessary and useful. To carry on a war for the overthrow of the international bourgeoisie, says Lenin, a war which is 100 times more difficult, protracted and complicated than the most stubborn of ordinary wars between states, and to refuse beforehand to maneuver, to utilize the conflict of interests among one's enemies, to reject agreements and compromises with possible allies, is not this ridiculous in the extreme? Is it not as though, when making a difficult ascent of an unexplored and hitherto inaccessible mountain, we were to refuse beforehand ever to move in zigzags, ever to retrace our steps, ever to abandon the course once selected, and to try others? Obviously, therefore, it is not a matter of reforms or of compromises and agreements, but of the use people make of reforms and agreements. To a reformist, reforms are everything, while revolutionary work is something incidental, something just to talk about, mere eyewash. That is why, with reformist tactics under the conditions of bourgeois rule, reforms are inevitably transformed into an instrument for strengthening that rule, an instrument for disintegrating the revolution. To a revolutionary, on the contrary, the main thing is revolutionary work and not reforms. To him, reforms are a byproduct of the revolution. That is why, with revolutionary tactics under the conditions of bourgeois rule, reforms are naturally transformed into an instrument for disintegrating that rule, into an instrument for strengthening the revolution, into a strong point for the further development of the revolutionary movement. The revolutionary will accept a reform in order to use it as an aid in combining legal work with illegal work to intensify under its cover the illegal work for the revolutionary preparation of the masses for the overthrow of the bourgeoisie. That is the essence of making revolutionary use of reforms and agreements under the conditions of imperialism. The reformist, on the contrary, will accept reforms in order to renounce all illegal work, to thwart the preparation of the masses for the revolution, and to rest in the shade of bestowed reforms. That is the essence of reformist tactics. Such is the position in regard to reforms and agreements under the conditions of imperialism. The situation changes somewhat, however, after the overthrow of imperialism, under the dictatorship of the proletariat. Under certain conditions, in a certain situation, the proletarian power may find itself compelled temporarily to leave the path of the revolutionary reconstruction of the existing order of things and to take the path of its gradual transformation. The reformist path, as Lenin says in his well-known article, The Importance of Gold, the path of flanking movements, of reforms and concessions to the non-proletarian classes, in order to disintegrate these classes, to give the revolution a respite, to recuperate one's forces and prepare the conditions for a new offensive. It cannot be denied that in a sense this is a reformist path. But it must be borne in mind that there is a fundamental distinction here, which consists in the fact that in this case the reform emanates from the proletarian power, it strengthens the proletarian power, it procures for it a necessary respite. Its purpose is to disintegrate, not the revolution, but the non-proletarian classes. Under such conditions, a reform is thus transformed into its opposite. The proletarian power is able to adopt such a policy because, and only because, the sweep of the revolution in the preceding period was great enough and therefore provided a sufficiently wide expanse within which to retreat, substituting for offensive tactics the tactics of temporary retreat, the tactics of flanking movements. Thus, while formerly, under bourgeois rule, reforms were a byproduct of revolution, now, under the dictatorship of the proletariat, the source of reforms is the revolutionary gains of the proletariat, the reserves accumulated in the hands of the proletariat consisting of these gains. Only Marxism, says Lenin, has precisely and correctly defined the relation of reforms to revolution. However, Marx was able to see this relation only from one aspect, namely, under the conditions preceding the first to any extent permanent and lasting victory of the proletariat, if only in a single country. Under those conditions, the basis of the proper relation was, reforms are a byproduct of the revolutionary class struggle of the proletariat. After the victory of the proletariat, if only in a single country, something new enters into the relation between reforms and revolution. In principle, it is the same as before, but a change in form takes place, which Marx himself could not foresee, but which can be appreciated only on the basis of the philosophy and politics of Marxism. After the victory, they are, in addition, for the country in which victory has been achieved, a necessary and legitimate respite in those cases when, after the utmost exertion of effort, it becomes obvious that sufficient strength is lacking for the revolutionary accomplishment of this or that transition. Victory creates such a reserve of strength that it is possible to hold out even in a forced retreat, to hold out both materially and morally. The party, in the pre-revolutionary period, the period of more or less peaceful development, when the parties of the Second International were the predominant force in the working class movement, and parliamentary forms of struggle were regarded as the principal forms. Under these conditions, the party neither had nor could have had that great and decisive importance which it acquired afterwards, under conditions of open revolutionary clashes. Defending the Second International against attacks made upon it, Kautsky says that the parties of the Second International are an instrument of peace and not of war, and that for this very reason they were powerless to take any important steps during the war, during the period of revolutionary action by the proletariat. That is quite true, but what does it mean? It means that the parties of the Second International are unfit for the revolutionary struggle of the proletariat, that they are not militant parties of the proletariat leading the workers to power, but election machines adapted for parliamentary elections and parliamentary struggle. This, in fact, explains why, in the days when the opportunists of the Second International were in the ascendancy, it was not the party, but its parliamentary group that was the chief political organization of the proletariat. It is well known that the party at that time was really an appendage and subsidiary of the parliamentary group. It scarcely needs proof that under such circumstances and with such a party at the helm, there could be no question of preparing the proletariat for revolution. But matters have changed radically with the dawn of the new period. The new period is one of open class collisions, of revolutionary action by the proletariat, of proletarian revolution, a period when forces are being directly mustered for the overthrow of imperialism and the seizure of power by the proletariat. In this period, the proletariat is confronted with new tasks, the tasks of reorganizing all party work on new revolutionary lines, of educating the workers in the spirit of revolutionary struggle for power, of preparing and moving up reserves, of establishing an alliance with the proletarians of neighboring countries, of establishing firm ties with the liberation movement in the colonies and dependent countries, etc., etc. To think that these new tasks can be performed by the old social democratic parties, brought up as they were in the peaceful conditions of parliamentarism, is to doom oneself to hopeless despair, to inevitable defeat. If, with such tasks to shoulder, the proletariat remained under the leadership of the old parties, it would be completely unarmed. It scarcely needs proof that the proletariat could not consent to such a state of affairs. Hence the necessity for a new party, a militant party, a revolutionary party, one bold enough to lead the proletarians in the struggle for power, sufficiently experienced to find its bearings amidst the complex conditions of a revolutionary situation, and sufficiently flexible to steer clear of all submerged rocks in the path to its goal. Without such a party, it is useless even to think of overthrowing imperialism, of achieving the dictatorship of the proletariat. This new party is the party of Leninism. What are the specific features of this new party? 1. The party as the advanced detachment of the working class. The party must be, first of all, the advanced detachment of the working class. The party must absorb all the best elements of the working class, their experience, their revolutionary spirit, their selfless devotion to the cause of the proletariat. But in order that it may really be the advanced detachment, the party must be armed with revolutionary theory, with a knowledge of the laws of the movement, with a knowledge of the laws of revolution. Without this, it will be incapable of directing the struggle of the proletariat, of leading the proletariat. The party cannot be a real party if it limits itself to registering what the masses of the working class feel and think, if it drags at the tail of the spontaneous movement, if it is unable to overcome the inertia and the political indifference of the spontaneous movement, if it is unable to rise above the momentary interests of the proletariat, if it is unable to raise the masses to the level of understanding the class interests of the proletariat. The party must stand at the head of the working class. It must see farther than the working class. It must lead the proletariat and not drag at the tail of the spontaneous movement. The parties of the Second International, which preach Gvostism, are vehicles of bourgeois policy, which condemns the proletariat to the role of a tool in the hands of the bourgeoisie. Only a party which adopts the standpoint of advanced detachment of the proletariat and is able to raise the masses to the level of understanding the class interests of the proletariat, only such a party can divert the working class from the path of trade unionism and convert it into an independent political force. The party is the political leader of the working class. I have already spoken of the difficulties of the struggle of the working class, of the complicated conditions of the struggle, of strategy and tactics, of reserves and maneuvering, of attack and retreat. These conditions are no less complicated, if not more so, than the conditions of war. Who can see clearly in these conditions? Who can give correct guidance to the proletarian millions? No army at war can dispense with an experienced general staff if it does not want to be doomed to defeat. Is it not clear that the proletariat can still less dispense with such a general staff if it does not want to allow itself to be devoured by its mortal enemies? But where is this general staff? Only the revolutionary party of the proletariat can serve as this general staff. The working class without a revolutionary party is an army without a general staff. The party is the general staff of the proletariat. But that the party cannot be only an advanced detachment. It must at the same time be a detachment of the class, part of the class, closely bound up with it by all the fibers of its being. The distinction between the advanced detachment and the rest of the working class, between party members and non-party people, cannot disappear until classes disappear. It will exist as long as the ranks of the proletariat continue to be replenished with former members of other classes, as long as the working class as a whole is not in a position to rise to the level of the advanced detachment. But the party would cease to be a party if this distinction developed into a gap, if the party turned in on itself and became divorced from the non-party masses. The party cannot lead the class if it is not connected with the non-party masses, if there is no bond between the party and the non-party masses, if these masses do not accept its leadership, if the party enjoys no moral and political credit among the masses. Recently, 200,000 new members from the ranks of the workers were admitted into our party. The remarkable thing about this is the fact that these people did not merely join the party themselves, but were rather sent there by all the rest of the non-party workers, who took an active part in the admission of the new members, and without whose approval, no new member was accepted. This fact shows that the broad masses of non-party workers regard our party as their party, as a party near and dear to them, in whose expansion and consolidation they are vitally interested, and to whose leadership they voluntarily entrust their destiny. It scarcely needs proof that without these intangible moral threads, which connect the party with the non-party masses, the party could not have become the decisive force of its class. The party is an inseparable part of the working class. We, says Lenin, are the party of a class, and therefore almost the whole class should act under the leadership of our party, should adhere to our party as closely as possible. But it would be Manilovism and Kvostism to think that at any time under capitalism, almost the whole class or the whole class would be able to rise to the level of consciousness and activity of its advanced detachment, of its social democratic party. No sensible social democrat has ever yet doubted that under capitalism, even the trade union organizations are unable to embrace almost the whole or the whole working class. To forget the distinction between the advanced detachment and the whole of the masses which gravitate towards it, to forget the constant duty of the advanced detachment to raise ever wider strata to this most advanced level, means merely to deceive oneself, to shut one's eyes to the immensity of our tasks, and to narrow down these tasks. 2. The party as the organized detachment of the working class. The party is not only the advanced detachment of the working class. If it desires really to direct the struggle of the class, it must at the same time be the organized detachment of its class. The party's tasks under the conditions of capitalism are immense and extremely varied. The party must direct the struggle of the proletariat under the exceptionally difficult conditions of internal and external development. It must lead the proletariat in the offensive when the situation calls for an offensive. It must lead the proletariat so as to escape the blow of a powerful enemy when the situation calls for retreat. It must imbue the millions of unorganized non-party workers with the spirit of discipline and system and struggle, with the spirit of organization and endurance. But the party can fulfill these tasks only if it is itself the embodiment of discipline and organization, if it is itself the organized detachment of the proletariat. Without these conditions, there can be no question of the party really leading the vast masses of the proletariat. The party is the organized detachment of the working class. The conception of the party as an organized whole is embodied in Lenin's well-known formulation of the first paragraph of our party rules, in which the party is regarded as the sum total of its organizations, and the party member as a member of one of the organizations of the party. The Mensheviks, who objected to this formulation as early as 1903, proposed to substitute for it a system of self-enrollment in the party, a system of conferring the title of party member upon every professor and high school student, upon every sympathizer and striker who supported the party in one way or another, but who did not join and did not want to join any one of the party organizations. It scarcely needs proof that had this singular system become entrenched in our party, it would inevitably have led to our party becoming inundated with professors and high school students, and to its degeneration into a loose, amorphous, disorganized formation, lost in a sea of sympathizers.
That would have obliterated the dividing line between the party and the class and would have upset the party's task of raising the unorganized masses to the level of the advanced detachment. Needless to say, under such an opportunist system, our party would have been unable to fulfill the role of the organizing core of the working class in the course of our revolution. From the point of view of Comrade Martov, says Lenin, the borderline of the party remains quite indefinite, for every striker may proclaim himself a party member. What is the use of this vagueness? A wide extension of the title. Its harm is that it introduces a disorganizing idea, the confusing of class and party. But the party is not merely the sum total of party organizations. The party is at the same time a single system of these organizations, their formal union into a single whole, with higher and lower leading bodies, with subordination of the minority to the majority, with practical decisions binding on all members of the party. Without these conditions, the party cannot be a single organized whole capable of exercising systematic and organized leadership in the struggle of the working class. Formerly, says Lenin, our party was not a formally organized whole, but only the sum of separate groups, and therefore no other relations except those of ideological influence were possible between these groups. Now we have become an organized party, and this implies the establishment of authority, the transformation of the power of ideas into the power of authority, the subordination of lower party bodies to higher party bodies. The principle of the minority submitting to the majority, the principle of directing party work from a center, not infrequently gives rise to attacks on the part of wavering elements, to accusations of bureaucracy, formalism, etc. It scarcely needs proof that systematic work by the party as one whole, and the directing of the struggle of the working class, would be impossible without putting these principles into effect. Leninism in questions of organization is the unswerving application of these principles. Lenin terms the fight against these principles Russian nihilism and aristocratic anarchism, which deserves to be ridiculed and swept aside. Here is what Lenin says about these wavering elements in his book One Step Forward. This aristocratic anarchism is particularly characteristic of the Russian nihilist. He thinks of the party organization as a monstrous factory. He regards the subordination of the part to the whole and of the minority to the majority of serfdom. Division of labor under the direction of a center evokes from him a tragi-comical outcry against people being transformed into wheels and cogs. Mention of the organizational rules of the party calls forth a contemptuous grimace and the disdainful remark that one could very well dispense with rules altogether. It is clear, I think, that the cries about the celebrated bureaucracy are just the screen for dissatisfaction with the personal composition of the central bodies, a fig leaf. You are a bureaucrat because you were appointed by the Congress not by my will, but against it. You are a formalist because you rely on the formal decisions of the Congress, and not on my consent. You are acting in a grossly mechanical way because you plead the mechanical majority at the party Congress and pay no heed to my wish to be co-opted. You are an autocrat because you refuse to hand over the power to the old gang. 3. The party as the highest form of class organization of the proletariat. The party is the organized detachment of the working class. But the party is not the only organization of the working class. The proletariat has also a number of other organizations, without which it cannot wage a successful struggle against capital, trade unions, cooperatives, factory organizations, parliamentary groups, non-party women's associations, the press, cultural and educational organizations, youth leagues, revolutionary fighting organizations, Soviets of deputies as a form of state organization, etc. The overwhelming majority of these organizations are non-party, and only some of them adhere directly to the party, or constitute offshoots from it. All these organizations, under certain conditions, are absolutely necessary for the working class, for without them it would be impossible to consolidate the class positions of the proletariat in the diverse spheres of struggle. For without them it would be impossible to steel the proletariat as a force whose mission it is to replace the bourgeois order by the socialist order. But how can single leadership be exercised with such an abundance of organizations? What guarantee is there that this multiplicity of organizations will not lead to divergency in leadership? It may be said that each of these organizations carries on its work in its own special field, and that therefore these organizations cannot hinder one another. That, of course, is true. But it is also true that all these organizations should work in one direction for they serve one class, the class of the proletarians. The question then arises, who is to determine the line, the general direction, along which the work of all these organizations is to be conducted? Where is the central organization which is not only able, because it has the necessary experience, to work out such a general line, but, in addition, is in a position, because it has sufficient prestige, to induce all these organizations to carry out this line, so as to attain unity of leadership and to make hitches impossible? That organization is the party of the proletariat. The party possesses all the necessary qualifications for this because, in the first place, it is the rallying center of the finest elements in the working class, who have direct connections with the non-party organizations of the proletariat and very frequently lead them. Because, secondly, the party, as the rallying center of the finest members of the working class, is the best school for training leaders of the working class, capable of directing every form of organization of their class. Because, thirdly, the party, as the best school for training leaders of the working class, is, by reason of its experience and prestige, the only organization capable of centralizing the leadership of the struggle of the proletariat, thus transforming each and every non-party organization of the working class into an auxiliary body and transmission belt linking the party with the class. The party is the highest form of class organization of the proletariat. This does not mean, of course, that non-party organizations, trade unions, cooperatives, etc., should be officially subordinated to the party leadership. It only means that the members of the party who belong to these organizations and are doubtlessly influential in them should do all they can to persuade these non-party organizations to draw nearer to the party of the proletariat in their work and voluntarily accept its political leadership. That is why Lenin says that the party is the highest form of proletarian class association, whose political leadership must extend to every other form of organization of the proletariat. That is why the opportunist theory of the independence and neutrality of the non-party organizations, which breeds independent members of parliament and journalists isolated from the party, narrow-minded trade union leaders, and Philistine cooperative officials, is wholly incompatible with the theory and practice of Leninism. 4. The party as an instrument of the dictatorship of the proletariat. The party is the highest form of organization of the proletariat. The party is the principal guiding force within the class of the proletarians and among the organizations of that class. But it does not by any means follow from this that the party can be regarded as an end in itself, as a self-sufficient force. The party is not only the highest form of class association of the proletarians, it is at the same time an instrument in the hands of the proletariat for achieving the dictatorship when that has not yet been achieved and for consolidating and expanding the dictatorship when it has already been achieved. The party could not have risen so high in importance and could not have exerted its influence over all other forms of organization of the proletariat, if the latter had not been confronted with the question of power, if the conditions of imperialism, the inevitability of wars, and the existence of a crisis had not demanded the concentration of all the forces of the proletariat at one point, the gathering of all the threads of the revolutionary movement in one spot in order to overthrow the bourgeoisie and to achieve the dictatorship of the proletariat. The proletariat needs the party first of all as its general staff, which it must have for the successful seizure of power. It scarcely needs proof that without a party capable of rallying around itself the mass organizations of the proletariat, and of centralizing the leadership of the entire movement during the progress of the struggle, the proletariat in Russia could not have established its revolutionary dictatorship. But the proletariat needs the party not only to achieve the dictatorship, it needs it still more to maintain the dictatorship, to consolidate and expand it in order to achieve the complete victory of socialism. Certainly, almost everyone now realizes, says Lenin, that the Bolsheviks could not have maintained themselves in power for 2.5 months, let alone 2.5 years, without the strictest, truly iron discipline in our party, and without the fullest and unreserved support of the latter by the whole mass of the working class, that is, by all its thinking, honest, self-sacrificing and influential elements, capable of leading or of carrying with them the backward strata. Now, what does to maintain and expand the dictatorship mean? It means imbuing the millions of proletarians with the spirit of discipline and organization. It means creating among the proletarian masses a cementing force and a bulwark against the corrosive influences of the petty bourgeois elemental forces and petty bourgeois habits. It means enhancing the organizing work of the proletarians and re-educating and remolding the petty bourgeois strata. It means helping the masses of the proletarians to educate themselves as a force capable of abolishing classes and of preparing the conditions for the organization of socialist production. But it is impossible to accomplish all this without a party which is strong by reason of its solidarity and discipline. The dictatorship of the proletariat, says Lenin, is a stubborn struggle, bloody and bloodless, violent and peaceful, military and economic, educational and administrative, against the forces and traditions of the old society. The force of habit of millions and tens of millions is a most terrible force. Without an iron party tempered in the struggle, without a party enjoying the confidence of all that is honest in a given class, without a party capable of watching and influencing the mood of the masses, it is impossible to conduct such a struggle successfully. The proletariat needs the party for the purpose of achieving and maintaining the dictatorship. The party is an instrument of the dictatorship of the proletariat. But from this it follows that when classes disappear and the dictatorship of the proletariat withers away, the party also will wither away. 5. The party as the embodiment of unity of will, unity incompatible with the existence of factions. The achievement and maintenance of the dictatorship of the proletariat is impossible without a party which is strong by reason of its solidarity and iron discipline. But iron discipline in the party is inconceivable without unity of will, without complete and absolute unity of action on the part of all members of the party. This does not mean, of course, that the possibility of conflicts of opinion within the party is thereby precluded. On the contrary, iron discipline does not preclude but presupposes criticism and conflict of opinion within the party. Least of all does it mean that discipline must be blind. On the contrary, iron discipline does not preclude but presupposes conscious and voluntary submission, for only conscious discipline can be truly iron discipline. But after a conflict of opinion has been closed, after criticism has been exhausted and a decision has been arrived at, unity of will and unity of action of all party members are the necessary conditions without which neither party unity nor iron discipline in the party is conceivable. In the present epoch of acute civil war, says Lenin, the Communist Party will be able to perform its duty only if it is organized in the most centralized manner, if iron discipline bordering on military discipline prevails in it, and if its party center is a powerful and authoritative organ, wielding wide powers and enjoying the universal confidence of the members of the party. This is the position in regard to discipline in the party in the period of struggle preceding the achievement of the dictatorship. The same, but to an even greater degree, must be said about discipline in the party after the dictatorship has been achieved. Whoever, says Lenin, weakens and belies the iron discipline of the party of the proletariat, actually aids the bourgeoisie against the proletariat. But from this it follows that the existence of factions is compatible neither with the party's unity nor with its iron discipline. It scarcely needs proof that the existence of factions leads to the existence of a number of centers, and the existence of a number of centers means the absence of one common center in the party, the breaking up of unity of will, the weakening and disintegration of discipline, the weakening and disintegration of the dictatorship. Of course, the parties of the Second International, which are fighting against the dictatorship of the proletariat and have no desire to lead the proletarians to power, can afford such liberalism as freedom of factions, for they have no need at all for iron discipline. But the parties of the Communist International, whose activities are conditioned by the task of achieving and consolidating the dictatorship of the proletariat, cannot afford to be liberal or to permit freedom of factions. The party represents unity of will, which precludes all factionalism and division of authority in the party. Hence Lenin's warning about the danger of factionalism from the point of view of party unity and of affecting the unity of will of the vanguard of the proletariat as a fundamental condition for the success of the dictatorship of the proletariat, which is embodied in the special resolution of the 10th Congress of our party on party unity. Hence Lenin's demand for the complete elimination of all factionalism and the immediate dissolution of all groups, without exception, that have been formed on the basis of various platforms, on pain of unconditional and immediate expulsion from the party. 6. The party becomes strong by purging itself of opportunist elements. The source of factionalism in the party is its opportunist elements. The proletariat is not an isolated class. It is constantly replenished by the influx of peasants, petty bourgeois and intellectuals proletarianized by the development of capitalism. At the same time the upper stratum of the proletariat, principally trade union leaders and members of parliament who are fed by the bourgeoisie out of the super-profits extracted from the colonies, is undergoing a process of decay. This stratum of bourgeoisified workers, or the labor aristocracy, says Lenin, who are quite Philistine in their mode of life, in the size of their earnings, and in their entire outlook, is the principal prop of the Second International, and, in our days, the principal social prop of the bourgeoisie. For they are real agents of the bourgeoisie and the working class movement, the labor lieutenants of the capitalist class. Real channels of reformism and chauvinism. In one way or another, all these petty bourgeois groups penetrate into the party and introduce into it the spirit of hesitancy and opportunism, the spirit of demoralization and uncertainty. It is they, principally, that constitute the source of factionalism and disintegration, the source of disorganization and disruption of the party from within. To fight imperialism with such allies in one's rear means to put oneself in the position of being caught between two fires, from the front and from the rear. Therefore, ruthless struggle against such elements, their expulsion from the party, is a prerequisite for the successful struggle against imperialism. The theory of defeating opportunist elements by ideological struggle within the party, the theory of overcoming these elements within the confines of a single party, is a rotten and dangerous theory, which threatens to condemn the party to paralysis and chronic infirmity, threatens to make the party a prey to opportunism, threatens to leave the proletariat without a revolutionary party, threatens to deprive the proletariat of its main weapon in the fight against imperialism. Our party could not have emerged onto the broad highway, it could not have seized power and organized the dictatorship of the proletariat, it could not have emerged victorious from the civil war, if it had had within its ranks people like Martov and Dan, Patrasov and Axelrod. Our party succeeded in achieving internal unity and unexampled cohesion of its ranks primarily because it was able in good time to purge itself of the opportunist pollution, because it was able to rid its ranks of the liquidators and Mensheviks. Proletarian parties develop and become strong by purging themselves of opportunists and reformists, social imperialists and social chauvinists, social patriots and social pacifists. The party becomes strong by purging itself of opportunist elements. With reformists, Mensheviks, in our ranks, says Lenin, it is impossible to be victorious in the proletarian revolution, it is impossible to defend it. That is obvious in principle, and it has been strikingly confirmed by the experience of both Russia and Hungary. In Russia, difficult situations have arisen many times, when the Soviet regime would most certainly have been overthrown had Mensheviks. Reformists and petty bourgeois Democrats remained in our party. In Italy, where, as is generally admitted, decisive battles between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie for the possession of state power are imminent. At such a moment it is not only absolutely necessary to remove the Mensheviks, reformists, the Tarotists from the party, but it may even be useful to remove excellent communists who are liable to waver, and who reveal a tendency to waver towards unity with the reformists. To remove them from all responsible posts. On the eve of a revolution, and at a moment when a most fierce struggle is being waged for its victory, the slightest wavering in the ranks of the party may wreck everything, frustrate the revolution, wrest the power from the hands of the proletariat. For this power is not yet consolidated, the attack upon it is still very strong. The desertion of wavering leaders at such a time does not weaken but strengthens the party, the working class movement and the revolution. Stalin work. I am not referring to literary style. What I have in mind is Stalin work, that specific and peculiar feature in the practice of Leninism which creates the special type of Leninist worker. Leninism is a school of theory and practice which trains a special type of party and state worker, creates a special Leninist style in work. What are the characteristic features of this style? What are its peculiarities? It has two specific features, A. Russian revolutionary sweep and B. American efficiency. The style of Leninism consists in combining these two specific features in party and state work. Russian revolutionary sweep is an antidote to inertia, routine, conservatism, mental stagnation and slavish submission to ancient traditions. Russian revolutionary sweep is the life-giving force which stimulates thought, impels things forward, breaks the past and opens up perspectives. Without it no progress is possible. But Russian revolutionary sweep has every chance of degenerating in practice into empty revolutionary Leninism if it is not combined with American efficiency in work. Examples of this degeneration are only too numerous. Who does not know the disease of revolutionary scheme concocting and revolutionary plan drafting, which springs from the belief in the power of decrees to arrange everything and remake everything? A Russian writer, I. Ehrenberg, in his story The Percommon, has portrayed the type of a Bolshevik afflicted with this disease, who set himself the task of finding a formula for the ideally perfect man and became submerged in this work. The story contains a great exaggeration, but it certainly gives a correct likeness of the disease. But no one, I think, has so ruthlessly and bitterly ridiculed those afflicted with this disease as Lenin. Lenin stigmatized this morbid belief in concocting schemes and in turning out decrees as communist vainglory. Communist vainglory, says Lenin, means that a man, who is a member of the Communist Party, and has not yet been purged from it, imagines that he can solve all his problems by issuing communist decrees. Lenin usually contrasted hollow revolutionary phrasemongering with plain everyday work, thus emphasizing that revolutionary scheme concocting is repugnant to the spirit and the letter of true Leninism. Fewer pompous phrases, more plain, everyday work, says Lenin. Less political fireworks and more attention to the simplest but vital facts of communist construction. American efficiency, on the other hand, is an antidote to revolutionary Leninism and fantastic scheme concocting. American efficiency is that indomitable force which neither knows nor recognizes obstacles, which with its business-like perseverance brushes aside all obstacles, which continues at a task once started until it is finished, even if it is a minor task, and without which serious constructive work is inconceivable. But American efficiency has every chance of degenerating into narrow and unprincipled practicalism if it is not combined with Russian revolutionary sweep. Who has not heard of that disease of narrow empiricism and unprincipled practicalism which has not infrequently caused certain Bolsheviks to degenerate and to abandon the cause of the revolution? We find a reflection of this peculiar disease in a story by B. Pilnyak, entitled The Baron, which depicts types of Russian Bolsheviks of strong will and practical determination who function very energetically, but without vision, without knowing what it is all about, and who, therefore, stray from the path of revolutionary work. No one has ridiculed this disease of practicalism so incisively as Lenin. He branded it as narrow-minded empiricism and brainless practicalism. He usually contrasted it with vital revolutionary work and the necessity of having a revolutionary perspective in all our daily activities, thus emphasizing that this unprincipled practicalism is as repugnant to true Leninism as revolutionary scheme concocting. The combination of Russian revolutionary sweep with American efficiency is the essence of Leninism in party and state work. This combination alone produces the finished type of Leninist worker, the style of Leninism in work. Pravda, knows. 96, 97, 103, 105, 107, 108, 111. April 26 and 30, May 9, 11, 14, 15 and 18, 1924. Collection Colorful Classics, 1. Marxism Leninism Maoism Basic Course Communist Party of India also available in German, Arabic, Italian 2. Philosophical Trends in the Feminist Movement and Urada Gandhi 3. Mini-Manual of the Urban Guerrilla Carlos Marighella 4. The Communist Necessity Jama Fawad Paul 5. Maoists in India. Writings and Interviews Azad 6. 5 Golden Rays Mao Zedong 7. Stand for Socialism Against Modern Revisionism Armando Luwinag 8. Strategy for the Liberation of Palestine PFLP 9. Against Avakianism Ajith 10. Specific Characteristics of Our People's War Jose Maria Sisson 11. Rethinking Socialism, What is Socialist Transition? Deng Yuanchu and Pao Yuqing 12. Fidai Guerrillas Speak on Armed Struggle in Iran Tahani, Ahmadade, Habash, Puyan, Ashraf 13. Revolutionary Works Seamus Costello 14. Urban Perspective Communist Party of India 15. 5 Essays on Philosophy Mao Zedong 16. Postmodernism Today Sarai 17. The National Question Ibrahim K. Pakaya. Collection New Roads, 1. From Victory to Defeat, China's Socialist Road and Capitalist Reversal Pao Yuqing 2. Silage choppers and snake spirits Dao Yuan Chu 3. Which East is red? Andrew Smith 4. Mao Zedong's On Contradiction, Study Companion Red Spark Collective 5. Critique of Maoist Reason Jamefa White Paul. Collection Works of Maoism, 1. Collected Works Communist Party of Peru 2. Selected Works, Volume 6 Mao Zedong. Collection Foundations, 1. The Foundations of Leninism Joseph Stalin 2. Wage